Okay, so I just wanted to have a chance to just kind of review some of the tools I use on physical penetration tests. What has seemed to work, what hasn't, and overall just kind of a real quick rundown of what I do. So first, physical penetration test, in my opinion, the biggest part that is most underlooked and that leads to the most success is reconnaissance. Starting out with your remote reconnaissance, just looking at Google, Facebook, what people put in pictures. They put a lot of things in these pictures in the backgrounds that could really lead to a successful compromise of an organization. Looking for logos, looking for equipment, looking for whatever you think could help you become a more realistic entity when engaging people, right? So one thing I usually find is copies of badges. Those are great because a lot of security professionals and trainers, they try to train their people to look for badges. And when you are challenged, the first thing that most people that are trained about physical security asks, can I see your badge or your identification? So if we can get something that looks similar and maybe passable, then we can usually trick most of the users. Now, I have had times where they take it out and they notice that it's a fake badge. And if you wanted to spend the money to get a badge printer, you could do that. However, what I tend to do is I buy a photo printer, and that photo printer I can then print out sections of it, and then I affix it to the RFID badge. All right, so identification, right? And so or reconnaissance. So in reconnaissance work, some of the big things that we want to look at is what can we do remotely. That means Google Maps. That means all of your open source information sources, right? Like Facebook, LinkedIn, things like that. Those are all beneficial, but then there becomes a point where you have to look at the facility, right? You got to find out where the entrances are, the exits, what are the fire areas, is there any roof access, right? Do they have something on the roof that you can possibly get into? What are the patterns? How do people drive and park to go into the building? Those are all things that you need to know before the engagement, simply because if you're spending all that time on the engagement to find out these things, you'll tend to look out of place. So one of my favorite tools is this. Now, I know you're looking at it, and it's a Mavic Pro, and your thought process is most likely like, well, how is that beneficial? Well, this is a 4-mile range, all right? So I can be 4 miles away and get to the facility and actually have a 4K video of the facility all around it as people are coming in and out. I don't even have to risk blowing my cover in that kind of engagement. Obviously, I wouldn't be 4 miles away. Most likely, I'd be maybe across the street or down the road. But this gives me eyes in the sky that I can see what's going on. And I have a video. I can, take a video and then review the video prior to the actual breach attempt. So those are a great tool. Something like this, a drone. I really think that if you're not using a drone, you're not doing reconnaissance right. Now, obviously, there's other reconnaissance that is going to need to happen. For instance, what I like to call my drive-by. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to shoot no one, but where I drive by the facility and look to see if someone notices me, right? Now, I'm not interacting with people. As far as reconnaissance goes, physical reconnaissance, I have a little bit of methodology behind it. What I tend to do is I focus on two things: personnel surveillance and security control surveillance. That means physical controls, to be specific. And each one of those I do 3 phases. Um, I'll do my static passive, which means I'm in a stationary observation post or point, and I review the surroundings, what people are doing, how they're behaving, and for physical controls, can I identify any physical controls from a observation post, right? For instance, gates, fences, things like that, and I take note of those items. And then after that, I do what I refer to as active passive. Now I know that that might seem like an oxymoron, which it is, but what I mean by it is I'm actively moving, but I'm passive in the sense of I'm not interacting. I'm not interacting with people. I'm moving around. It could be in a car, it could be on foot, whatever the case may be in the circumstance. Um, and the thing about it is I'm looking for those 2 things, right? What are people doing, and what kind of controls are there? Um, and then what I do after that, and I don't always do it, but I do it if I feel like I can get away with it. And that is dynamic active. That means I'm interacting. I'm actively interacting. I'm pulling on doors. I'm seeing what's going on. I might be talking to people. However, I want to still stay low key, and I'm not trying to breach at this point. But however, I want to see how people behave when I interact with them. Now, I try to be as covert as possible. I don't want my cover being blown at this point, but I do want to see how is their environment, how are they behaving with a new variable in their environment. Those are very good points to isolate and to identify when you're doing your reconnaissance. So we've got all this great data from reconnaissance. Now what do we do? What I tend to do is I kind of digest all that information. I look to see if there's any glaring holes that I could possibly exploit, right? Like, for instance, they have egress sensors in the double doors. I mean, those are ones that you've seen over and over again on multiple YouTubes and conferences and things like that. Crash bars, right? Popping out crash bars in the middle of the doors. Then obviously your social engineering and things like that, and attacking the locks themselves. I tend not to attack locks per se because it takes a lot of time, and time is something that you really don't have in a lot of physical engagements. So once I've gathered all this data and I've looked for all these weaknesses, I'll start to establish a cover story. With that cover story, it's basically something that is realistic and makes sense in their environment. For instance, say they have 2 sites, right? They have a primary site and a secondary site. The secondary site is a satellite site that does not usually work with the other sites. I will say I'm from the primary site, obviously, and then when I'm at the secondary site or at the primary site, it might not work that way because they're going to be a little bit more close knit. So depending on the size of them of the organization is going to depend on what my cover story is. I usually like to give a give me in my cover story. So basically, if someone's paying attention, they should notice that, hey, I'm a superhero. That's why I usually name myself as Anthony Stark. Anthony Stark is obviously the name of Iron Man, Tony Stark. So I do that simply to give people a chance. And also I use Anthony because that's my first name, is Anthony. So I try to model my cover story as much after myself as possible. That it makes it easy for me to keep things in line, and also that I'm not lying for the most part. I'm Anthony. I have 4 kids. I like Star Wars. Those are all real statements, and as much real statements as you can throw in there makes it more believable because it's true. It's pretty simple, right? So cover story is very important. So once you establish your cover story, that's where you create your card. That's where I create a fake get out of jail free card. So I don't rely on the get out of jail free card completely. I have a fake get out of jail free card that I create for my persona, and if someone tries to stop me, I will give them that first to see if they can catch on, right? Because I don't want them to give. I want to see at what level do they catch me, and at which point do they identify that something's off. And I think that gives it a more realistic test base. All right, so what does my breach tools look like, right? I find that the more simple the tool, the more effective the tool. Um, I have the whole lockpick set and everything like that. Only break that out for fun, honestly. I don't really even take it on engagements anymore. What I take instead is maybe a piece of cable, right, of a pliable piece of metal that I can fit places and try to trip things, or a bundle of metal, right? At this, it's pliable enough. I can fit it under doors, over things, and if I'm attacking a door physically, things like this is just amazing, and it's only like $6 at Lowe's. It's great. I can just shape it in any way I want, and I can use it for reaching things, touching things, triggering things, stuff like that. And I think most people already know about the under the door tool, which I do have. So we do use the under the door tool in our engagements. However, it works, but depending on the time of day that you're using it, it's kind of obvious you're carrying around a big piece of metal, and it's not very covert. Now, being overt sometimes is covert. I mean that means if you're doing something obvious or something that looks like only someone that is supposed to be there would do. People think, well, if he was really trying to attack us, he wouldn't be so obvious, right? So being obvious is sometimes is very covert. Yeah, another thing that we have in our arsenal is what's called a DDT. So this basically can fit in between a door, switch it sideways, and turn it that way, and it trips crash bars. Crash bars or the rail bars. So a lot of organizations they do not put that metal beam in the middle of the doors of a double door, and a lot of times they have the crash bars for out, and so when they go home they just release the crash bar and it pops out. So people can still egress, but no one can ingress without a key or a badge. And so what this does is it just goes in, pulls that crash bar and pops it out. Simple. It works. What I used to do that sometimes is also just a piece of metal. It works the same way, and I can adjust it and bend it how I want, and shape it, slide it in, pull it out, boom. Same principle. All right. And then screwdriver, right? So anything that if the door is not fit right and the latch isn't correctly in the door, especially on electronic doors, this works great. Just pop it right out. So also I've used scissors. I've used anything really that I can get in between the doors. Credit card tricks, stuff like that. But those are usually for interior doors, not so much for exterior. And then, obviously the egress sensors and things like that. So now, recently I encountered a two-factor entry where it uses a retina scan and a badge. Now, I can clone a badge with the RFID cloner from Boss Cloner. However, with that second factor, it's very difficult, right? Now, that's where ingenuity and this comes into play. So like I said earlier, you can bend this to however you want, any method, right? And it's only like $7-8. So what I did is I took some metal, adjusted it, slid it, taped the badge that we cloned onto the end of it, because they badge out for egress, slid it under the door because there's enough room for it to slide under, maneuvered it around to the door, to where the badge reader was. Bob's your uncle. The door's open. Bypassing two-factor authentication in less than a minute. It's not rocket science. It's just basically looking for those gaps. Looking for, is the door fitted right? Is there a gap underneath that I can fit something? Now, say with that door, I was lucky enough that it had a window where I could see the badge reader. But if you're in a circumstance where you can't see the badge reader, that's where something like this comes into play. This is just a little camera snake. I bought it for $15 on Amazon, and I can snake one of these under a door if it's big enough at the bottom, and then I can see where the badge reader is. However, that increases difficulty because now most likely I might need a second person. All right, so there's other tools that are out there, and I'm pretty sure that most of you already know many of them. But I tend to think that the more stuff I have on me, the more difficult it is to be covert, right? To fit in. Unless I'm doing some sort of construction site, it's kind of odd for someone walking around with all these big pieces of metal and things like that. So if it's after hours, okay, but then I have the whole alarm situation that you have to deal with, right? So if they activate an alarm, that's just another level of complexity that you have to deal with. But however, I have seen circumstances where placement of the alarm panel is important. So if you can see it from the outside and say someone in the back turns it off to get in the building and you're on the other side of the building, attack the door. But most times it doesn't work out that way, unless you're in a shared facility that has 24-hour access. Now it's a money situation. Okay. So how other ways can we get in? Social engineering, obviously, and I'm sure that a lot of you have seen different things about social engineering. My take on social engineering is I tend to not want to be a service person, right? That means I don't want to be a UPS guy. I don't want to be an elevator repairman. I don't want to be any of that noise. I want to be an employee. I want to look like an employee. I want to act like an employee. I want anybody that's there to think that I'm an employee. Because when was the last time you let a UPS person on your computer? Nope, doesn't really happen. I mean, if it does, I mean that's definitely a bad situation. But elevator repairman, that's a great. There's a lot of big guys in the industry that do that. I don't really do it. I tend to think that if I can pass myself as employee, new hire from IT or whatever, I have a better chance of getting to their sensitive data. So when I develop my social engineering background, or when I'm about to social engineer someone, obviously what everybody else is teaching is great. You know, the whole quid pro quo and things like that, where I'm going to give information about myself. They're going to give me a bunch of more information. I'm there to help. You know, always be helpful, always be kind, always be courteous. Treat them like you'd want to be treated, and they will reciprocate. That's really the down and dirty of what social engineering is. When you're following someone in, be confident. Say someone is about to catch you. Don't shy away from them. Go towards them. Look them in the eye. You know, talk to them friendly, in a friendly manner. And those are like, I have found that those are the keys right there. If you can engage with people in that manner, just kindly, courteously, and always be helpful, they're going to let you on their computer. I mean, even the most secure organization, users are the weakest link. It's just the way of it, you know, the quantity of users, their background experiences, and everything else just goes into that. Another thing that I kind of get on a soapbox about when it comes to social engineering is playing to cognitive bias. All right. So what I mean by that is, what do you think when you see a guy going down the street with a cowboy hat on and some Wranglers and a button-up shirt that looks like flannel or plaid, you think he's a cowboy, he rides a horse, he has a truck, he dips. All these different things come to mind immediately. That's what's called a cognitive bias. You have a bias that you can't even control about. You have preconceived ideas about this individual based on what they're wearing, how they hold themselves, what they look like, things like that. So if I can tap into that, now that's something, right? Because now, they're thinking to themselves, oh, this guy's trustworthy, this guy's good to go, right off the bat. So I was in the Marine Corps, and so I usually play to that. I play to, oh, I'm a service member just getting out. And so first things that people do is they're like, oh, well, thank you for your service. And they think certain things about me right off the bat, that I'm trustworthy, that I'm courteous, that I'm a patriot, right? Now, those aren't necessarily true, but it's just what people perceive. So playing to cognitive bias is a great way to social engineer your way into a data center or into someone's computer or into a sensitive area of an organization. Beyond social engineering, once you're in there, you're going to need some technical ability to establish C2 and things like that. They do have some easy buttons as far as like your pwn plugs, your LAN turtles, which are all well and good. However, they do have some configuration overhead. You can also use MSHTA as far as if you get access to a computer, establishing a connection back. So network mission control or access control is starting to become a lot more popular in most organizations today. And with that, it becomes more challenging to get on a network. While bypassing NAC is more challenging, it's not impossible. So to understand how to bypass NAC, you have to understand what NAC is. NAC really is 802.1x, IEEE 802.1x, which is a standard. And with that, in that standard, there's three components to it. There is a supplicant, an authenticator, and an authentication server. So to understand that a supplicant is basically just a piece of software that's on a device that is used for EAP, which is Extensible Authentication Protocol, to authenticate to the authentication server. The authentication server then sends back to authenticators, say, hey, this is good to go on our network. However, there's a lot of devices that do not support this supplicant, right? So with those devices, things like phones, like your Avaya phones or whatever, and your printers, we can use what's called MAB, or MAC Authentication Bypass, which is simply just we clone or spoof a MAC address. And then as long as it's not conflicting, so we unplug the whatever device is authenticated and plug our device in with the same MAC address, it can authenticate. However, some devices like your Cisco ISC and your Aruba ClearPass, they do have more advanced profiling features, which makes that avenue a little bit more difficult. But it's still possible and it still works. Now let's say we're working on this organization and all those methods failed. What now? Is it over? No, not at all. A lot of times people leave computers open, when they go to the restroom or whatever, and just jumping on one of those and then establishing an MSHTA payload to a C2 that's sitting on, Amazon. That's command and control right there. Now, obviously, it's not preferable because now you have a C2 connection at the user's level, which is usually, a user, hopefully if they're doing it right, and there's no administrative credentials or privileges. But there's also comm closets, right? So think about it like this. The person configuring that switch is a person, an administrator. And people tend to do the least amount of work they have to do. So when they're rolling out things like NAC, they'll tend to only focus on used ports. And in addition, they usually don't shut down ports that are not used. So if you can get into a comm closet or a data room or a server room and find unused ports, those usually do not have NAC on them. One second. So one other thing I tend to do, is once I have set the flag and I have NAC installed, or I've bypassed NAC, and I've owned their network, I don't call it a day. I used to get out, and depending on how many facilities they have, might just warrant one that we go further, and the other ones we just go in there, plant the flag, and leave. But if it's their primary facility, I tend to exit the facility and see how many other ways I can get back in. I find that this gives a more thorough test for the organization and shows multiple avenues of approach. For instance, if I bypassed a door, right, or I tripped a sensor, or I popped a crash bar, or I did a under the door tool, or whatever I did, I'll go back and I'll try a different method. I'll try social engineering. I'll try tailgating, and even in social engineering, I'm going to try different ways. Right, I'm going to tailgate someone. I'm going to try to talk someone into opening a door for me, stuff like that, and it usually works. So. And especially once you've gotten in, you're going to have that confidence that just breaking in high, it's usually a domino effect after that. And so it's really good to just see how many times in different ways you can break in. And it shows a clipping level for the organization where they can see where they fare, where they're strong at, where they're weak at. Maybe they need to, start repairing their doors a little better and fitting them right. Maybe that's the case. Maybe they switch to electronic locks, and hey, it doesn't quite fit the latch. So those are all things to look at. All right, so I think that's pretty much a quick rundown of my method. It's obviously not holistic, and it's just a quick, brief overview of kind of things I look for and things I look at. But I hope this was edifying for whoever is watching this. Have an excellent day.